Hi, everybody. This is lecture 8 for Ethics and Moral Problems on the topic of capital punishment. Perhaps on the surface, this does not seem that it is as controversial as the last couple that we've done, abortion, LGBTQ, but I'm not so certain. I think this does take a different tenor in our public discourse, but nonetheless, it's an important aspect of how we as a people approach ethical issues. We know the popular arguments for the death penalty, right? No one who did what they did deserves to live. They should suffer, just like the victims that they have perpetrated the crime against suffer. Also, for soft arm murderers, what are people going to think about our culture overall? Are we overly permissive? And society's not even safe if they're, kept in prison. They could still be a danger, at least to other inmates, if not to guards and such. So why should they live? And we also know the arguments against the death penalty. We could keep these, we could keep society safe. We have the technique, at least in developed countries, to have these people in solitary confinement. So why do that? And also, what if we execute an innocent person? And how do we remedy that? And why are we the only Western in the United States, the only Western developed country that still has this barbaric practice? And perhaps no person has the right to kill another. These are the popular arguments. And we also know what the common ground is on these things, right? First of all, nobody's saying that a guilty person should not be punished. So we have no qualms about that. We're debating what type of punishment. And we also say that only the guilty person should be punished. So we have to have some authentic way to, legitimize that this indeed is the person. Now, sometimes it's very clear, like if we have a mass shooting, like unfortunately we just did at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and nobody's really questioning did that individual do it. But innocence and guilt are not just something that's based on do we know the person that did it. There's a lot of mitigating factors that go in. Now, I'm not speaking about that situation. I know very little to nothing about it. It just broke in the news at the time of this video. But we also know that the level of the criminal offense should, be proportionate to the punishment. We're going to be doing sometimes incommensurabilities, like somebody might say, well, if somebody took a life, then isn't it simply easily to measure that another life should be taken? Well, but enough now to going through some ethical systems, then everything's that clear. These are not just isolated cases that just affect two people. So anyway, as philosophers, we're going to have to come at this without ever, again, diminishing our passion or our energies. We almost have to have a disinterested, reasoned argument about this. We want to base how we understand this and look at this on factors that are not simply initiated by our emotions. All right. So anyway, let me see here. We analyze these from the context, and we're going to determine if and where error might be. So, we'll start just like you would in any logic course. We'll start by maybe talking about a few terms, and then we're going to try to say, like, what are the propositions? Like, what are the true statements we can say about this? And then sort of build an argument, and then make sure that argument doesn't have any, fallacious either material or formal elements. And we also have to be very humble and realize that as new information may come into play, that we must consider that. And also, if anybody reproaches our particular arguments, we have to allow them to help us perhaps understand the situation better. So we're always going to be, at least humble to say that we could change our minds. All right. So your text did a very good job of laying out the parameters of the situation and the history. So I will not go over those. I'm not trying in these lectures to ever just simply reiterate what's in your book, but there are a few things that I think are worth, pointing out. So this might be a little overlap in the beginning. Two basic positions, right? There are those people who would like to see the death penalty totally gone, the abolitionists. Now, they would affirm that no life can be forfeited, right? Innocent people could be put to death. So all the popular arguments would fall underneath this. And then there's the other group, the retentionists, who believe that, they'd like to see the death penalty remain, perhaps even increase, because they see it as on various levels as a determinant, or perhaps simply just a form of justice that needs to be laid out. And then they brought you through a few ethical, like 4 or 5 ethical systems. And I'll just sweep through them here. And like Hobbes and Rand, who are both egoists, but Hobbes himself was pro the death penalty. He thought, somehow this need to maintain peace in society. Rand, also the egoist, was opposed to it. Um, Perhaps because she said that the innocent themselves could be executed. John Stuart Mill, utilitarianist, he thought it was a better deterrent than life in prison. Now, you got to keep all these people in the context of when they were alive and when they were doing their own philosophies. Sometimes, as the text had shown, these things can have a little bit of variances in the factors that we have in our particular society today. Kant, the deontologist, you can never use a person as a means to an end. So he, in his categorical imperative, he says to keep them accountable as a way to a shirt, treating them not as an ends and or as an end and not as a means. So he was pro. You have Marx and his radical justice, who tied all this into race and capitalist theories, and that somehow this was the state's way to almost like, how do they want to say it, exasperate social anxiety and divert attention from the real causes of poverty and crime. And the natural law, you'll see that that had five, if you want to say, characteristics or such. Retribution was a consideration, protection of society, deterrence, moral reform, and also implementation of civil authority. So they had these five things, and we're not going to apply all those, and I'm not going to walk through those. I'm going to try to add something to the conversation. Okay, so there was this book that I went through by Matthew Kramer, published by Oxford University Press in 2014. It was entitled The Ethics of Capital Punishment, a Philosophical Investigation of Evil and Its Consequences. Now, this particular book favors capital punishment, and it critiques a lot of the standard arguments that are out there. Um, and it talks about a little something that's a little novel, and a natural evil that's present. So it thought that capital punishment, at least the argument Kramer makes, is the capital punishment has to address this natural evil. So this is not like a dogmatic or religious argument. So I'm not offering, the few theories that he puts forward in defense of death penalty. I myself am opposed to it, but I do think that he clearly states some of these. So it's worth looking at those. So let me tell you about these. First one is the deterrence-oriented theories. Okay, so few of the philosophers that you read fall into that group. Also, people who would be, retentionist would also fall in this group. Now, these are consequentialist claims, and they based on the foundation of empirical data. So in other words, if you're going to say something's a deterrent, then you're going to have to make the case that this is actually how it is. Wherever we've instituted the death penalty, we have seen less crime. That's going to be part of it. So the findings, unfortunately, are often controversial, and they're not conclusive, right? So these deterrence-oriented theories, and also they're retrospective in view. So punishment fits the heinous crime, and the death penalty is supposed to create like a climate of justice. Now, retributivism theories, right? These are more deontological claims. So think Kant, and they center on the victim who has been transgressed. Right, so we have to fix, what has happened to that particular person. So the punishment is commensurate with the crime that is committed. What good result achieves out of this is not really something that's considered, right? It's like we're following through with this basic rule that we have in place, and what other effect it has on society is, this is not a consequentialist theory. So it's simply a matter of justice. The incapacitive rationale theories. This is also a consequentialist claim that the person needs to be prevented from wreaking havoc in the future. In other words, if we can incapacitate the individual from harming other people, then that's an important aspect of the death penalty. So it's not so much aimed at deterring others. So you can see how, even though the deterrence theory was also consequentialist, and so is this isn't as concerned with deterring others. It's simply saying, look, we need to have this person stop doing what he's doing, create a climate of justice. So putting the person to death, they don't evaluate that morally. In other words, you're almost putting a rabid person down, is how the book presented it. It'd be like a dog who cannot be controlled, if you want to say it that way. So this theory makes a weak case for not opting for other alternatives. So people who would say, What about lifelong incarceration and such? It doesn't really have strong arguments against that. And the fourth one is purgative rationale theories. Okay, this is rather dogmatic. It's biblically based on the concept that the community has been defiled with some sort of evil with individual, and the community must be purged of this evil, which is present in that particular individual. This isn't simply religious. This could talk to secular evils, which is where he goes with this. Meaning, in the case of mass shooters and serial murderers, or unrepentant sexual predators of children, we have to resolve this evil as a collective body. So anyway, Kramer talks about those four: the deterrence-oriented theories, retributivism, and incapacitative rationale theories, and purgative. All right. If you're a literary person and you like Albert Camus, which I love that existential philosopher, the myth of Sisyphus, the stranger, and such. He wrote an article, an essay in 1957 entitled Reflections on the Guillotine. Now, he was adamantly opposed to uh, any state sponsored executions. As a matter of fact, he thought that these types of things were nothing more than state sponsored revenge, and he called it the most premeditated of all murders. So his point was that this is only going to further breed violence in society. He also thought that there's no absolute authority in any state, by that I mean country, of course, who could pass judgment. In a sense, we are all guilty on some levels. So where are these pure people? Since we have no religious authorities, he's an atheist. He doesn't accept anything dogmatic. So how do we, as imperfect people, make these what are in a sense perfect, irrevocable judgments? He thought perhaps the person should just be put into hard labor, and if so, allow them to commit suicide. That was his thoughts. Anyway, just as an interesting side note, within the Roman Catholic Church, there was a recent comment by Pope Francis, who had said, the death penalty, should just simply be abolished. There has been like an evolution on this, right? So where you had like the Christian United States in the 19th century, who was a proponent of the death penalty, and a secularized Europe where they were becoming abolitionists. So that, the idea there, that sounds ironic, and it really is. But the idea is that, for an atheist, death is the final and highest evil to take a person's life, seeing as there's nothing that, comes afterwards. Oftentimes in Christianity, there were various reasons, often sometimes weirdly understood as, well, this is a chance for the person to make themselves right before death. So you see a conversation between the secular world and Christianity, particularly Catholicism, where not only are they not hoping, but not only have they found that, this conversation has revealed things in their own beliefs that, in a sense, lay dormant. So you see like an evolution that had went from proponents of the death penalty to probably in the 1970s and such with Pope John Paul II, where the death penalty was permitted but should be used rarely, if ever, especially in developed countries, to now where it's basically saying that there's no reason to use it whatsoever. So it's interesting. So now here's the last thing I want to talk to you about before I get off this topic, is we have to ask ourselves, what is the cultural effect of the death penalty? And dare we even say the spiritual effect, even if we want to talk about it like on a natural spirituality, how does this affect us? The wild card in anything like this, and this is why proportionalism and some consequentialist theories are very difficult to iron out, is because you don't have, if you're going to weigh two things, like, the goods and the bads, how is it that you're going to be certain that you have all the bad effects that will come from this? So how does this play out? Like, what kind of climate of justice does this really give us in our culture? Does it foster some sort of thirst for revengeance? If we didn't have the death penalty, would its absence give us a climate of permissiveness? I mean, these are the things that we're really trying to iron out. But the reality is that, we're members of a culture, and we're all influenced by the culture, oftentimes unbeknownst, by both the actions and the omissions of things that happen. In the same way, that all personal experiences shape our particular thinking, so too do these events in our culture and what we accept as cultures shape our cultural experiences, right? So it's very hard for us to separate our thinking about these influences from the cultures that we're embedded into. That's the role of philosophy. It's dragging us out of the cave so that we can see things right. So in society, justice is always connected to peace. All right. So where there is peace, you will see greater justice prevail. So it's kind of like an intermingled thing. The greater the justice, the greater the peace, and the greater the peace, the greater the justice. Our cultural peace, too, is influenced by the level of personal peace that we feel. So, I mean, this is not like there's not like a culture out there. We're always part of this, correct? So each one of us shapes the culture that we're in, and we are also shaped by the culture that we are in. Dorothy Day, the Catholic social worker, anarchist, and worker with poverty, she wrote an essay back in 1954 entitled "Are the Leaders Insane?" And she was making this point. I have two quick, quips. If you want to say, two good people to bring out this point. This was her essay was written not too long after the testing of the hydrogen bomb. Now, the hydrogen bomb, as opposed to the nuclear bomb, the nuclear bomb might wipe everything out within a mile. This hydrogen bomb can wipe everything out within 10 miles. They thought it could be anywhere from 40 to 100 times greater. So anybody who grew up in the 70s and 80s is familiar with the acronym MAD, MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. In other words, we have enough weapons to kill each other, and nobody ever just is going to fire one of these. We're going to wipe out entire cities. And so hence the title of her article: "Are we insane?" I mean, how could we not think that the power to destroy brotherhood and humanity like this is not going to affect how we look at each other? I mean, she's trying to make the point that we are not foreigners in our own land. We're embedded in this, and these things that exist in our culture and how we could look at weapons of mass destruction and such is going to affect how we look at each other. That's her point. Okay, we can't insulate ourselves from this. If you read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham prison, he clearly states, when he was questioned, why are you in this state, protesting? You're not even from the state. And he was like, well, why is it that you think, how did he say, what affects one directly affects all indirectly. Okay, so even if this doesn't directly affect me, it affects everybody indirectly. So I'm here because there's an injustice and I have to stand up for this. Well, we can talk about, are we islands of culture? No. So where we fall as a people on this issue of the death penalty is going to affect the culture that we're in, right? There's no disconnecting individual justice from societal justice. So getting this right determines peace in our society. It forms our individual peace and our own well-being. In the same way that whatever food we let into the body, it goes from the outside to the inside, is going to affect our health, so too anything that we let from the culture, from the outside to the inside, is going to affect our physical health. And we could even say cultural health. What we have to understand, from just the point of reason itself, is that how would I want to say this? Reason is the gate that is supposed to allow things in. I mean, reason is what we would use to control our thoughts, our feelings, and emotions and such, right? But there are things that can bypass reason, things that are simply unbeknownst to us. Good examples of this are: have you ever laughed at a joke that was inappropriate? But you laughed before you realized what it said, or you got caught up in a particular song or tune, and then realized the lyrics are not something that you would agree with. In other words, if somebody would just spoken them to you, or if you would have read them, you might have been a little incensed that this is not right. But these things have the power to kind of get around the gate and bypass reason, and we have to catch ourselves in that. Okay. Well, it's the same way with things in the culture. We don't realize how sometimes these things get permeated. We accept them, that even if we don't accept them, rationally, we accept them in the sense that we allow them to permeate our beings. They become it becomes polluted water that we swim in. But if we don't know what clear water is, we don't really recognize the polluted water. So my point through all of this is there's really no neutral grounds on something like this, right? We have to find some ways to determine. So I'm going to end just by saying, What is the cultural effect? And dare we even say the natural spiritual effect of this on us as human beings? So anyway, I hope that helps a little bit, and off to the discussions.